Whoa, look at that thing.
All right. So it's just basically a plank of wood. And he's foiled out the nose a little bit. And it's, I don't know, 3.5 feet long.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and once you get it on edge, once you get this edge in the wave, it just takes off. It's super fun.
It looks awesome. What kind of wood is that?
You know, I gotta ask him what he used. I'm really not sure, but it was sealed. He might not get it back. That's how excited I am about it.
Oh, he let you borrow it.
He just left it at the house because he was gonna boat surf. We boat surfed on it, and he like stood on it. He didn't just lay on his belly.
Oh wow.
Yeah, kind of like a alaya, like a short alaya. Yeah. So I took it out at Spot X and at the end of my session, and just rode on my belly like normal Pipo. And I don't think because I have that surf mat. Surf mat is impossible to duck dive. Right, so
really?
and there's no leash, so you just basically just get destroyed, like just getting out. This thing you can push under, no problem, and then it's so easy to get into waves. You just line up perpendicular to the power, and off it goes. And then you just need to make sure that you're over. You set that inside edge, and then it just takes off. As soon as you lose that edge, it just spins out, and it's super fun.
That's
so
awesome.
Fun. Yeah, so you'll have to try it.
Could he surf it behind the boat?
Yes.
Without the rope?
We didn't try. He was still getting used to it, but he was riding it just fine in the curl of the wave with the rope.
Wow.
And I definitely think he could have. It's hard though, like you have to keep this sharp edge in the wave. And as soon as it gets released, it slips away. So it's really temperamental.
Yeah, it looks beautiful.
And then you can see here, he's concaved out just right here. Just a nice little concave right there. He did a great job. I mean, for an ER doctor, not a shaper.
Yeah, it looks good, man.
Rad. Anyway,
that's very rad.
It's my new obsession.
That's cool. I want to try that thing. Maybe that's his side business.
Anyway, I figured I'd put something else in the background other than
it looks cool. Yeah, it looks cool, man. It's hipster.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the show, guys. Dropping in Surf Show, episode 14. My name is Rob Case. We've got Jim Segelnik here as well. He's a doctor of physical therapy. And you can visit him at saltypt.com. Visit me at surfingpaddling.com. This is a show about math and science and surfing. And we've got some really fun stuff to share today. So today we're going to go back to the video. So if you are watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see what we're talking about. But if you are listening, we'll do our best, right, Jim, to try to describe what we're reviewing. So I sent you, I'll go ahead and share my screen here so that you can take a look. Can you see that okay?
I can see it, yep.
Okay, cool. So what we're looking at is Stab in the Dark All-Stars. So if you don't know about the show, it was released a few months ago, I think, on Stab magazine. And it's where the first one was with Julian Wilson, I think, and then Jordy, Mick, and Dane have all done it. And basically a pro surfer gets all these boards. They're totally blank. You don't know what they are. They have a great idea of what the board is, but then they ride it and they're supposed to rate it, right? And it's actually really entertaining because you get to hear their feedback before they figure out what the board is. So they brought all the guys that had already done it. So they brought Jordy and Dane and Mick together, and Julian couldn't make it. So 20 minutes into this thing, Mick blows out his ACL. And is gone. So had I paid for this when it first came out, I'd be pissed because Mick was surfing so well during this filming. But what I wanted to go over with Jim, since we got Jim here, is we're going to take a look at the video and discuss what happens, because it's actually a pretty rare case where we get to see the incident on camera. at full speed, and then we can rewind it and slow it down. So that's kind of what we're doing today. I'm excited about it. First off, I wanted to talk a little bit of physics with you, Jim, because I think this is the move that he was trying to do. He talked about he wanted to do a layback. So this is an earlier move where he comes shooting out of the barrel at pretty high speed, and then he does this layback, right? And I think that's what he was trying to do. He said he was trying to do a layback. But I'll talk a little bit about the physics for you and for the others. So the interesting thing about this maneuver that he's doing is that it kind of goes against the grain. And by that I mean all of his momentum's moving down the line. You'll see all this speed moving down the line as we shift forward. And then he puts it on rail. And as soon as he puts it on rail, you start to see the board starting to turn, right? But during this frame, his momentum, all of his mass, is still moving down the line. And I'm drawing arrows to the left, to right, that he's surfing. And he's starting to cut back here, but all of his momentum is still continuing to go this way. But you can see here, once he's on edge, then if this is the action of his mass moving down the line and basically into the board, what's the reaction? Because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, the reaction is that there's pressure back here on this. He's on rail, he's leaning, and so you have pressure on the bottom of the board counteracting the pressure moving down the line, right? And so now there's all this pressure and force along with torque. And I think in this episode earlier we talked about torque. I think it was episode 3 or 2 or one of those earlier ones. But essentially there's a lot going on here. And what happens with this reaction that's hitting the bottom of the board is that normally on cutbacks, if you're not going to lay back, which he's already putting a lot of pressure on this tail, and he's going to lay back and basically stop himself, right? So he's stopping all of that momentum and he's putting on the brakes, as opposed to a roundhouse where he would put this on rail, gain speed through the turn, come back to the whitewash and bounce off it and then continue on, right? So it's here he's actually taking all that momentum and stopping. On a roundhouse, as his momentum goes down into the board and the water resists that, because out here there's no real power, and so he's gaining speed from his momentum being carried through the turn if he were to turn this all the way through to a roundhouse. So the water actually hits the bottom of the board, and then it's got to go somewhere, and so it shoots out the back and creates thrust. That action creates a forward movement around that curve. But in this, so that's a normal roundhouse, where a normal roundhouse you're actually carrying your speed through it all the way around, and you see the guys like Joel and Mick, they come out of the turn like that with more speed than they went into. This one you can see he's actually putting on the brakes, so it's a different mechanics. But the physics, all that momentum, all that force needs to go somewhere, right? And so where does it go? It doesn't propel him around. He's got to take all the force into his legs and into his body. And that's what happens on the next time he does that, and something's got to give, and something gave. So does that make sense, Jim, the physics behind that turn?
Yeah, I really enjoy how you explain that.
So this is the layback that he was trying to do, where his knee did not buckle. And you can see here the knee strengthens all the way through the turn, and he kills all of that speed. Completely dead in the water right here, and then he's got to use gravity and then the speed from the wave to get going again. So fast forward to where he busted his knee. Here's the wave at full speed. He's going down the line. He gets barreled. It's a right again. And he sets up basically exactly the same, and it just popped. So there's a better look at it. And I'll slow down this one out actually in full speed. You've seen this a couple times. So here's the slow-mo. Yeah. Boop! And right there, that's where it goes. So if you see the way that he set up, he takes a little bit more of a vertical line than in that last layback. But he described on the beach, he's like, yeah, I was setting up for a layback. So you can see here he's starting to kind of stop his momentum. His momentum here, it's still going down the line, but it's more up at this point, right? Because he goes from the lower part of the wave kind of more of at a diagonal instead of straight down the line. But all that momentum, once again, is being resisted by the bottom of the board right there. Okay, so as he comes around, and I'm kind of going frame by frame here. He starts at the very top of the wave, and he makes a very light curve with a look how he's turning the board around that axis point, and then right here is where that edge kind of locks in. So the rail locks, and now all of his momentum's going again down the line, and then the resistance, the reaction to that motion is pushing here, but because he's basically stopping himself, then all the force goes into that back leg right there, and I think you could see it when the knee goes right there between that frame and that frame. So you would look at that and be like, oh, that's like Craig Anderson drop knee. But because there's so much force going down and into it right now because of the force that he came into, so the action-reaction, I think that's where the knee kind of just gave out. And then boop, he's done for at that point. So that's the physics behind it. What's going on with the knee at this point?
Yeah, you mind playing it again in real time so we can get a just kind of sense of how that looks. Yeah.
Do you want this view right here? This close-up?
Yeah, that view's good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Here's full speed. Well, they slowed it down. So is that good, or do you want to go back to the full speed? See how fast it all happens.
If that's not a pain in the butt.
No. Watch. There we go. We'll even add the barrel in. So we've gone back to the full speed. You can't really see the knee as well. Boop. See, because the wave in front is kind of blocking it. Do you want that one slowed down?
No, that was good. The other view is probably better.
Yeah. I like this one a little bit too because it's more front on. It's just that wave kind of gets in the way. Right there. Now, as opposed to his other turn, his back knee was really kind of locked, more like a squat in the last one. This one, it's kind of locked, and then right there, he brings it in. And then there it goes.
Yeah, I guess you got to wonder if it was on its way going further in just from some of the physics you laid out, or if that was like a byproduct of the injury. You know what I mean?
Right.
Chicken or egg.
I mean, he was ripping in this session. And it was funny, in the video they talked about how I think he was getting like 18 waves to Jordy's like 6 and Dane's 5.
Yeah, I think Dane labeled Jordy and Mick assassins or something. And
that was
something like that. And comparing their wave counts. And I guess that session, I think Dane made a comment that Mick was over getting barreled while Jordy and Dane were just kind of hanging out for a bit. So, yeah, I mean, as we all know, Mick is outstanding. And, yeah, I guess it just kind of begs that question. Like, you have, obviously, one of the most skilled surfers in our time who's probably done that turn thousands of times. Why now, right? Why would it let go? And, you know, you talk about the physics of maybe the knee was a bit more this, or maybe the angle on the board was a bit more that. And I think, you know, Mick's probably obviously an expert in all those nuances and those sensations under his feet. And so, I think in the realm of... And so, if we didn't say it, and if you haven't seen the episode, we all know Mick tore his ACL, his anterior cruciate ligament, which is one of the internal ligaments of the knee. and it's one of the most commonly torn knee ligaments amongst athletes, especially surfers, and especially now more with the aerial game. And to do it on a turn like this, what I would probably say is a dime a dozen turn for Mick, and to see it let go was like, it was truly fascinating. And I don't know, Rob, if I necessarily have answers, but more questions to why this happened. And
Can you describe the ACL a little bit? Like, if I'm looking at his back knee here, right? You said it's internal. Is it on one side or the other, or is it right down the middle?
It's kind of right down the middle. And so just to kind of give the viewers some basic nomenclature, front and back is termed anterior and posterior. So anterior is the front part of the knee, like where the kneecap lives, and then posterior is the back. And then lateral is the outside of the knee. So on Mick's right knee, it would be like if his right hand went down and touched his leg. That's the outer, or the lateral. And then the medial is like the inner part of the knee closer to the other knee.
All right, so anterior front, posterior back.
Right.
Correct? And then lateral outside.
Yep.
And then medial inside, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
And so the ACL is essentially right in the middle part of the knee, and I'll kind of do a figure with my hand. If this is the top of the thigh bone and we're looking at it, and this is the top part of the tibia, the lower leg shin bone, the ACL kind of sits what we call anterior medial and posterior to lateral. So I'm crossing my fingers like this. So my middle finger, and for those that are listening, probably can't see it, but I'm taking my middle finger and crossing it over my index finger. And the ACL is kind of like the strut that runs from the anterior medial portion of the tibial plateau, or the top part of the shin bone, and then it goes posterior to lateral, and it attaches to the condyle, the lateral condyle of the femur. And so it's kind of like it covers this kind of oblique axis, right? And so since it sits on that oblique axis, all ligaments by really their nature are essentially restraints. So if we had our shoe on and we tied shoelaces, the shoelaces keep the shoe on the foot. Ligaments are essentially the same thing. They're keeping things stable so they don't maybe wiggle around as much, so to speak. They also have some unique function with things like proprioception because they're innervated with nerve endings. And so we talked I think a bit about that last time on what proprioception is, and it has to do with some of that complicated nervous system stuff going to the spinal cord and brain and reacting back. So the ligaments play a big role in that. But biomechanically speaking, what the ACL does is it's a restraint, and it limits the tibia, or the lower leg bone, from translating forward, what we call anterior translation.
Yeah.
It also limits valgus, which is what you saw Mick's...
What we're seeing, yeah.
What you saw Mick's knee fall into, which is sometimes called knock-kneed, or femoral collapse is another term that's commonly used. Mm-hmm. And so it limits front and back planar motion, mainly anterior translation. That valgus position, which is primarily in the frontal planes, side to side. So, in other words, it limits the knee from going inward. And then it has a rotary restraint as well. It limits the what we call femoral or thigh bone, femur, internal rotation. In other words, tibial external rotation. So it limits this twist in the knee.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's like, that valgus position is thought to be, and I don't want to use the word unsafe because, like, in the world of strength and conditioning, this is a bit of a debatable topic, and you've heard me talk about how the body adapts and so forth. And so a lot of the studies that are out there on ACL mechanisms of injury are kind of like what we're seeing right now. Usually we see some sort of valgus incident.
Yeah.
And then from that we would go, okay, well, valgus is bad, don't train into valgus, and so forth. And so from that kind of mechanism, we go, all valgus positions must be bad, therefore let's avoid them. And that might not be the most accurate thing to say, it's like, I guess that's debatable. So like, I think if you put heavy load, like if you're doing a back squat or something like that, and you purposely drive your knees into valgus, obviously that's not going to feel good. But like we've talked about before, there's a certain sense of adaptability or flexibility, whatever you want to call it, where like you mentioned Craig Anderson, like why is his back knee able to go into valgus every single turn and nothing happened to him? So I don't think we're there yet in the research, but so I guess that's what the ACL is. I don't know if
yeah, totally. So
was that an okay description?
Yeah, I'm just going to reiterate from my own understanding and maybe for the listeners as well. So the ACL is preventing this anterior and posterior movement, or limiting it, right?
Yep.
Of the leg. It's also the lateral to medial. It's limiting that valgus and lateral movement as well, correct? So
yeah, primarily the valgus, so the medial drive of
So mostly kind of this axis, but not to the outside. And then it's limiting rotation of the upper femur.
That's right.
The lower. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So in this move, like we saw him do this turn just fine, and his leg didn't go into valgus. It held through the turn. So in this instance, there was just too much load, and because it's almost as if it did snap right there, because you can see it just goes to valgus, whereas the previous layback, it was a little bit inward, but it was never, if we go back to that one, it was never like an extreme version of it. Let's see, where is it? Is it this one? I think it's this one. I mean, he was just absolutely tearing it up. Yeah, you can see here, right there's where most of the load, and you can see it's not turning inward.
Yeah.
So at this point, basically right there, so you can see right there's where all the load happens. You can see it with how deep the rail goes right there. It almost buries the whole board. That's where most of that momentum and all that force is going into that leg. And it's going in kind of at a lateral angle. And so maybe, this was, I don't know if they mixed up the clips. Well, I guess they must have. This must have happened before because his leg went out, right? So we do have a timeline on this.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if it just got worn out, like tired, or there was something underlying. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, it's a non-contact injury, and, if we're talking about non-contact ACL tears, we would have to say that they were most likely preventable. Shit happens in sports, so, I guess this is just kind of fun to talk about or debatable. But, I mean, there could have been all sorts of contributing factors. Like you said, maybe there was just the biomechanical contributing factors for why this happened would be maybe he cut a little bit different and it put a little bit more force through the knee, and so the force of the turn exceeded the capabilities of the tissues to withstand the tearing kind of mechanism. Now, in general, it's let's just leave proprioception out of it and talk mainly about the muscles and tendons. Those things are like these kinetic springs that are like dampening force, right? So if you go back, or maybe you start there and we'll go frame by frame. And so his lead leg is an extension, his back leg's in flexion, and here he's kind of creating that corkscrew mechanism of generating torque to drive the turn. And if you pause right there, you see how his back knee is super bent compared to his front. His knee is in flexion, so the quad and the hamstring are working with what we call co-contractions, meaning they're trying to stabilize the knee by contracting at the same time. And just given the angle of his trunk, we would presume that there's some glute activation as well there as well at the same time with maybe some back and core activation. If his trunk was bent forward a little bit more, we'd say maybe the glutes are pulled in a little bit more. But because his knee is bent and his ankle is getting reactionary force from the board, it's going up in the dorsiflexion. Right. And so from that, you're mainly getting the deeper calf muscle known as the soleus, which serves ACL protective function because it attaches below the knee and behind the knee. And so if the ACL, like we talked about, is a restraint of not allowing the tibia to go anterior, the soleus is working eccentrically to kind of counteract that force, as are the hamstrings. And so we would hope that muscle system would do its job. And so we'd go, okay, well, if it failed, maybe the muscle system had something to do with it. And probably the most notable thing that we see in the literature, and I think I mentioned this way in the beginning when we started this podcast, a lot of the research is done on cohorts like adolescent female soccer players because that seems to be the one of the most prominent groups of having ACL type of tears, especially non-contact type of ACL tears. But we would say, okay, well, things we could focus on would be strength, power, endurance, and with endurance comes fatigability. So we could look at this and we go, okay, well, what context do we have? Well, it's stab in the dark. He flew in a night or two before.
A night. He was there for 20, maybe 24 hours, they said.
Yeah, here you go.
Yeah.
And what was his sleep like the night before? How many beers did he have staying up how late with Jordy and Dane and the camera crew catching up? And now you put him on a new board, right, that he's not accustomed to. It's like, okay, so what we know is with sleep becomes with poor sleep becomes increased fatigability. And so maybe this is an hour, 2 hours into a session. This is the 20th time he's done this turn. That whole kinetic chain, that elastic kind of like kinetic spring system we just described, is now a bit more fatigued, and now here we go, right? Yeah. And then you combine that with a nuance of the board. He's not quite used to it. That's futzing with that nervous system kind of reactionary control, that whole proprioceptive stuff we talked about last time, and that could have been enough to do it. So
there's so much working, is what you're saying, and that's my question was going to be: did his fatigue possibly have something to do? Again, we don't know. We're completely speculating about this, but could it be a possible cause? And it sounds like it could, but not only just on a physical level, but on the proprioceptive level in the nervous system that we talked about, as you said. His body's learning this board.
Yeah,
and it's going through. It's working. His brain is working. The muscle fibers that are connected to those movements are working. All three of them said this board felt stiff to all of them. And so if he's partway through this session on this new board and he already kind of in the back of his mind thinks it's stiff, he's reinforcing that mindset that it's stiff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so all these things are kind of building up, and maybe I'm picking at straws here, but if we were to analyze it, which we can right here because that's what we get to do because we're not Superman like Mick,
mm-hmm.
That could definitely play a role. Which means if we were to take a lesson away from this, regardless of whether this is the reason for his blown ACL or not, but making sure that you guys are getting sleep and rest before you go out and surf for 3 hours.
Oh, yeah.
I agree. I think it's like for you and I, now that we're getting older, it's always that one more wave. It's always that one more repetition. You're like, I'll just do one more. And that's when you get hurt. Every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, obviously we don't have Mick here, but if he was my client or patient and I had him right here in front of me, I would have so many questions for him. And Mick's such a high-end athlete, like he could probably tell us why it happened,
yeah. Well, he could probably tell you exactly what he felt in each frame.
Yeah, totally. But if we had the luxury of talking to Mick right now, like, what do we know? Okay, so we've already established maybe fatigue played into it, just given the whole context of what Stab in the Dark is, right? Like, he showed up, probably took a red eye or a long flight, caught up with his friends. I would presume he stayed up late, maybe got subpar sleep compared to normal. Now he's got those strikes against him. How
hard did he work the day before? How hard did he surf?
Yeah, that too.
Leading up to this?
That too. And then you got, like, okay, what's his nutrition like? What's his hydration like? Are those things playing into the fatigability of his tissues because he's in a new country? Some of the biomechanical things, we commented on strength, endurance, power, fatigability of the muscles and tendons. We can look a little bit more if you hold that frame right there, Rob. He's like in that kind of valgus position there. So what he needs there is dorsiflexion mobility. And if he lacks dorsiflexion mobility, the tibia is going to go further into what we call internal rotation, which again is going to put tension and drive the knee into an increased valgus position. So we know limitations in the talocrural joint, i.e. the ankle, specifically with dorsiflexion with closed chain tasks such as this. If we run out of available range of motion at the ankle, well, the physics are it's going to look for the motion further up the chain, right? And so the knee is going to be potentially more susceptible to things like ACL or MCL sprains and tears. And if you go a couple more frames, so what we don't see here, we already talked about the front to back plane with the knee being bent and what the quads and hamstrings are doing. But the hip also needs flexion, which is a bent position, and it also needs internal rotation. Now here's the deal. We could either be, so that whole complicated thing we just described with dorsiflexion, ditto for the hip. If there's limited hip internal rotation, the path of least resistance is going to be through the pelvis, SI joint, spine, and perhaps driving more force in a valgus manner through the knee. And so these are biomechanical things that if I had Mick on a table, we would look for. We could easily check dorsiflexion mobility, hip flexion, internal rotation mobility. We can easily do tests looking at his fatigability, strength, power of his quad, hamstring, soleus, glutes. Some of that cool stuff Dr. Stephen Duhigg was talking about was what's his core, what's his multifidus fatigability look like, and some of that research is maybe coming down the pipeline, but that could potentially play into it. Maybe down the road we'll be talking more about that. So just the biomechanical things would be those things: mobility, strength, endurance. Those are kind of like what most people think of. The more modern day stuff is the stuff we already talked about, kind of maybe some of that more, not necessarily psychosocial stuff, although maybe he felt a bit of stress to get up early because the cameras were on him and he was shooting a show. I don't know. But those would all be kind of questions or things that I would want to look at for Mick. And what else do we know about Mick? Well, he also had a proximal hamstring tear where he avulsed the pelvic bone, which is such a tough injury. And I don't know what leg that happened to him on, whether it was his left one or his right. But I think it was around 2004 he did the splits, doing a floater. And he essentially tore the hamstring, which is the muscle behind the thigh, on its proximal, or what we call the upper attachment, where it attaches to our sit bone. And he actually tore a little piece, I believe, of the sit bone off. Now, let's pretend for a minute that that was on his right side, right? If that was on his right side, even though it was a long time ago, could that have set him up for something like this? Because maybe it led to some hip stiffness, some decreased tissue flexibility in the area, which limited his proprioception, which would bring us back to that screening mechanism we talked about last week of that CAT-SIB test, or the modified CAT-SIB, which was that foam and dome. So standing on a single leg, eyes open, eyes closed, head rotations, and repeating with the foam. And so if we saw something relevant like hypothetically speaking, if we could do these things before he went and surfed, like if we saw relevant things in tests like that, then we could go, hey Mick, work on these simple things. And essentially that's how my screening tool got developed, right? Essentially if Mick came to me and went through the screening program, maybe we could have picked up things that might have been things that he could have worked on to potentially prevent something like this. Not trying to say I would have saved the day. That sounds kind of silly, because a lot of these tears are so multifactorial and we just control what we can control. But there's a lot of like biomechanical, nervous system things that we could do to potentially prevent things like this.
It sounds like it depends, Jim.
Well, that's it. That's it. I really, as much as we want to pin it on a one answer, like many things in the body, it's usually a combination of things that drive the outcome, not just one thing.
Yeah, a couple things that I took away from this, just from a biomechanical point of view, is, I drew here, you got your hips, you got your ankle, and you have your knee right in the middle. So if you, in thinking about, again, the amount of force, the load that's going into this, he's starting to recompress right here in this frame. So all of this mass, all of his weight, plus the momentum of him moving in that direction, is all falling into this system, onto that leg. There's a little bit of load in the front, but a lot of it is loading on that back leg because he's stopping himself. Had he come around like a normal cutback, more of it would be on the front. It'd almost be more balanced, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's so fascinating to me. You have an immense amount of load and speed onto these three kind of areas, and like you said, if any one of those just doesn't have the mobility or doesn't have the strength, then it kind of gets pushed to another part of the line, and the knee is right there in the middle. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that's kind of almost like, well, I tried to find mobility in the hip, it wasn't there. I tried to find mobility in the ankle, wasn't quite there. Mm-hmm. Well, knee's next, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not meant to go in the direction that it ended up going in terms of that amount of load. So I was thinking earlier, like, could you replicate this in the clinic? Could you load somebody up to a point and then have them have to make a similar movement like this to see, and again, this is totally hypothetical, but to see if that would make the ACL blow. Mm-hmm. Of course, you would be like, dude, you're insane. You're like causing pain on this person. I would try to improve that person, use that. But again, this is the way a math brain works. It works in extremes on one end or the other. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking, just could we replicate I think it'd be difficult to replicate, but it's just in my mind, a nice thought exercise, and learning from you, of course, how important keeping everything mobile, strong, at just a base foundation. You can walk throughout your whole day and say, I'm strong, I'm fit, I went for a swim today, no problem, my lungs are fine. Mm-hmm. But you give me that CAT sim test and I fail miserably at it, and then I brush it off as, whatever, it's just a balance test. Mm-hmm. But this is, if you want to go to this level of surfing or load, that's the litmus test.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it kind of goes back to like doing simple things well, right?
Yeah.
So we could essentially deconstruct it and then reconstruct it from there. So if Mick is now doing post-op stuff, the post-op stuff at some point in time looks a lot like ACL preventative stuff. So what do we need? Well, we need good ankle mobility, specifically dorsiflexion. We need full knee range of motion after an ACL reconstruction, assuming he had surgery. I think he did. He would need full flexion, full extension, so straightening and bending. He would also need full rotation of the knee, which is sometimes an overlooked thing. There is rotation capability at the knee, and oftentimes that gets overlooked, and then that kind of futzes or potentially can futz with that whole proprioceptive mechanism. The drawback is when you start trying to restore rotation, or certain techniques might be too aggressive at certain points in the graft healing process, depending on what tissue was used to reconstruct the graft, whether it was autologous from his own body or a cadaver graft. And so, you need full knee range of motion. You would need, let's just say, full hip range of motion, emphasis on flexion, in other words, knee to chest, internal rotation, if it's his back leg for sure. But clinically, we're trying to look for all planes of movement. We want full or as close to it as we can. If he had any other pain in his body that could have futzed with this whole approach, we would want to address that. Who knows? Maybe he was nursing a niggling hamstring thing, or maybe he had a little thing in his back. We would need that to be addressed to make that whole system work better, right? Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about that last time. That's our low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. Assuming mobility is good and it doesn't have to go in this order, we would need strength, endurance, power of all those selective systems. And PTs, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I'm a bit myopic, but I come from a little bit of the old school approach where we would really want to make sure each individual muscle group, as much as we can't really isolate muscles like we think we used to be able to, but we'd want good soleus strength, good calf strength, good quad strength, good hamstring strength, good glute strength, good hip abductor strength, good core strength, right? And then we would want to put it together in what we call compound movements. So that's where your deadlifts come in. That's where your Olympic lifts come in. And those are all simple things. And then we would take them through the whole cat sib. And these are things we would do to prevent injury as well. And if we assumed everything that I just rattled off was pretty good, then we start going, okay, how do we keep your fitness up? In other words, how do we train endurance, power, and keep our mobility looking good? Once we have mobility, it's pretty easy to maintain if we're just doing lifting and training. Training that looks a little bit more like, I don't want to say CrossFit, but incorporating Olympic lifts in just general, what I would call good fitness.
And full range of motion exercises.
Totally. So deep squats, lunges, and varying it and getting in your cardiovascular exercise, which goes to that endurance thing. Because remember, it's a system. If he's getting fatigued paddling and now he's standing on a surfboard because he's lacking oxygen and recovering, his lower quarter is still not going to work well. You know what I mean? So it's working on like the more and more systems as we're getting more or less myopic. We're working on more and more systems, and so the cat sib stuff. So that's all that balance stuff. So training balance, and then assuming all that's pretty good, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think sport specific stuff starts coming into play, and that's where maybe some of that like Carver board stuff works really well. You could start like picking up the speed, picking up the vigor if you had a nice bank, and really work on turns in a controlled way.
With load too, because that will also carry your momentum into the turn.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so as soon as his therapist said let it rip, which would be down the road, this wouldn't be something he would do shortly post-op. That's an excellent training tool to like think about the movements involved with doing a turn like that again. So he could kind of control the speed and gradually pick it up. And that's a kind of turn where it's kind of like snowboarding. If you go very slow, you can't do it. You need a certain amount of speed to kind of have some rigidity or kind of hold to it.
Well, exactly. That's the physics behind it, is that out on the shoulder, there's no power in the wave. He's getting all of his power from his momentum. It's bizarre if you think about it. He's getting all of the speed or ability to make this turn happen from his momentum going down the line in the direction he was going in. And then once he puts it on edge, there's the reaction on the bottom side of the board that helps them finish the turn. But to your point, without that speed going down the line, if you're like just tootling down the line and then you try to put it on rail like that, you're just going to fall over on the butt. Yeah, 100%. What I'm hearing from you, and I'm trying to relate it to the everyday surfer, you know, because Mick, he's got all the time in the world to do all this stuff, man. He's a pro surfer, right? And he's retired now. He's a retired pro surfer, even better. But like, you know, you and I, we work all the time. We've got families. You know, how do we fit and prioritize these things in? Now, we aren't doing like Superman size hacks like he is. We're not putting that much load. But if you were to scale down his surfing to the everyday surfer, there are instances where you and I would be going down the line at OB and we'd be putting almost the equivalent amount of ratio of load into our turn that he put into that turn. So equivalent size, you know, and given our fitness level and our leg, and our leg's going to go. So my big question to you then is, all right, given all the time in the world, those are great. Let's do it all, right? But given limited time, do you think that these full body exercises are better than the really isolated stuff if you had limited time? Are there certain activities that you would throw in? Because you can't do carver, you can't weightlift, you can't do stretching, you can't do cardio all in the same day. You're going to have to break it all up. You know, you got to do meditation, you got to do your journaling, right? Like we talked about last week. You got to do all these things, right? We're like, you got to do all these things, guys. So how do you fit it in the everyday life?
Yeah, good question. And I guess the short answer is I don't know. You know, yeah. But
how do you do it? How do you do it?
Yeah, good. Like, you know, I mean, I have an unfair advantage because I'm a trained professional. You know, so like I know. I probably have a different understanding than other people, right? So it's like, I know if I have a niggling thing going on with my body, that's my focus until it's better, right? And so I'm constantly assessing my body in terms of how it feels to perform, you know? Yeah. And so I feel like I'm pretty attuned just from a history of athletics combined with what I do every day working with athletes. So,
but that is great advice as is, because if somebody is dealing with some sort of ailment that they can feel or this limiting factor in their body, what you're saying is take care of that first, right? And really focus on that, get that so that your body feels good, you feel mobile, you feel flexible, you feel energized, and then you can work on all kind of the foundational movement kind of exercises that you've referenced.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, I'll go over some myths that I think are very limiting that I think I hear just surfers talk about. And I know plenty of surfers that surf really well that do zero strength training. And if you ask them why, I hear things like, well, maybe I don't need it. It'll make you bulky. Maybe it doesn't prevent injury. You know, there's all sorts of reasons why a person might not have to be incorporating some sort of resistance training in their week. And if you're one of those people, I guess my question would be, how come? You know, there's so many benefits with strength training. And going back to your question, it doesn't need to be full body movement versus small muscle movement. Why not both, right? Because, I mean, that's a debate that could go on for the next 10 years, you know, but incorporate them both because they both have their role, you know. And if you're unsure what those movements are, find a trainer, right? Find a trainer, find a PT, get someone to assess your body. I mean, you wouldn't put a bunch of money in the stock market blindly. You would get a professional to help you out. You wouldn't buy a house without, you know, consulting with a mortgage broker or a realtor. You would find people, right? And so we don't have to be left to our own devices when it comes to our bodies, but you know, in my mind, what's a sign of a good coach, a good PT, a good trainer is it's a relationship that doesn't build dependency, right? Like it's so if you saw me, my job is to teach you about your body. Most of us have one or two kind of things that tend to come up from time to time. I hear, I throw my back out once a year and then it lays me up for a week. And so, okay, so that's something that's going on in your body. Let's let's maybe think about working on that. I had a hip injury years ago, and ever since then it doesn't quite move the same. Great, let's work on that. But if you're one of the lucky individuals that has none of that, there's all sorts of things you can do to not only prevent things like ACL tears, but all sorts of injuries with surfing, not to mention general health. But for whatever reason, and I don't know why, stretching and foam rolling seems to be pursued more than heavy Olympic style lifting these days amongst people that I work with. And I think the thought is, okay, I'm going to roll out and stretch to get more flexibility, to become more mobile, and that's going to prevent injury. And I think that's fine. It's just kind of an old school belief that we might want to challenge gently and go, like, those are good tools, but they're not the end-all be-all tools. They're not really the tools that prevent a lot of injury. Like, there's research scrutinizing what prevents more injury in athletics. Is it strength training? Is it endurance training? Is it foam rolling? Is it stretching? And strength training wins. Stretching does very little to prevent injuries. Kind of let that sink in, because that's not what you and I got in high school PE,
no,
right?
Man, stretching.
We've come a long way since then. So what prevents a lot of injuries is just slowly building physical capacity through things like strength training. Mm-hmm. So if we're not doing that, do it. And if we're unsure how to start, contact someone.
Yeah. So I've got kind of a summary of this, because I get bored really easily with doing the same thing. Hence the X-Swim program, why every day is different. And so I think if I were doing strength for weeks, months, right, and then I got bored with it, maybe I'll go do some stretching, do some mobility, do some balance, and then I'll go back to strength. But having kind of the blueprint in front of me that strength is going to help with both injury prevention as well as mobility if you do it right? And so it's almost like a catch-all, like you get it all in doing those things. But again, I think we've talked about how the body adapts so quickly that if you're doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, you get really good at that one thing. But then your body makes all different movements in surfing. And so it's actually better to, in your training, do different things throughout it, because you never know how you're going to contort your body, how the wave is going to come down on you, and how you're going to need to contort your body underwater, for example, those sorts of things. So I'm just hearing, have variety. Be okay to change things up. Yeah, variety is the spice of life,
I think, I like that statement, and but try not to lose sight of how beautiful the simplicity can be too, right? So like if it's like 6 to 8 weeks to yield maybe a 5 to 10% strength change at best, like progressive loading is slow. Right? Yeah. And so if we don't acknowledge that, we might get bored too quickly and not give it a chance to take hold. So I think it's okay to be boring sometimes, like just as long as you're not, I think, letting that like really off rail kind of what you're doing. And but like generally speaking, I think most good trainers will look at like if you have a hip joint, and you could play this game all day long with every joint. If you have a hip joint, it's a ball and socket joint and moves in all planes of motion. So you should strengthen it going front, you should strengthen it going back, you should strengthen it going in and out, and then internal, external rotation, right? And then that, that's open kinetic chain, and then you could do the same thing with closed kinetic chain. Start doing deadlifts at various depths, right? So it's like there's subtle ways. I mean, there's literally thousands, if not millions, of kind of variances of exercise. Like, okay, I could do a squat with my trunk bent forward. I could do it with my trunk upright. I could do it with different load. I could do it with my toes turned out. I could, you know what I mean? And we can go on and on. So I think the foundational movements should be a staple in a program, like things like push, pulls, squats, things like that. And then you can vary them till the end of time, really. But like, I wouldn't say get bored with squats and just never do squats again and do like, partial squats on a BOSU ball. I'd say, well, you should still be working deep squats, right? If you want to like be an athlete. But like, if you get bored with it, maybe take a reprieve from it, add a band around your legs, or, mix it up with a ball toss at the bottom of your squat or whatever it might be. But, and that's where a good trainer comes in to keep you engaged, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, cool, man. I think we beat that one to a bloody pulp.
I think you're right.
If anybody has questions or want to add to our discussion, make sure you get a hold of us. Thank you guys for the awesome feedback we've gotten so far for the podcast. You've gotten some, I've gotten some, which is really cool, and it's good that people are listening. It makes me feel good inside. Yeah,
no, it's been fun, and keep it coming. If any questions come up that you think Rob and I can maybe shed some light on, please just email one of us, or comment on a YouTube video or something, and
we're not going to answer it, Jim. We're going to say we don't know, but we'll research the hell out of it.
Yeah, or you'll just ask me and I'll stammer for an hour about how it all depends.
It all depends. No, absolutely. Thank you, guys. Gives us a great excuse to get together and chat. And until next time, we'll see you in the water.
See you guys.